Hello, everyone. My name is Lori Peak. I am a professor of sociology and the director of the Natural Hazard Center here at the University of Colorado Boulder. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Making Mitigation Work webinar series hosted by the Natural Hazard Center and made possible with the support of the Federal Emergency Management Agency and the National Science Foundation. This webinar series highlights recent progress in mitigation policy, practice, and research. We are so grateful that you have joined us today. Before we begin the webinar presentation, we wanted to note that this forum is being recorded. The captioned webinar video and the presentation slides will be posted online at the Natural Hazard Center website, hazards.colorado.edu. This is also where you can find the recordings and supplemental materials from the 3 prior Making Mitigation Work webinars. Today, we will also ask a poll question of those who have downloaded the Zoom application. Unfortunately, if you are in a browser view of this webinar, Zoom limits your experience and you can't answer the polling question. So if you need to download the application, now is the time. We also wanted to remind all webinar participants that thanks to a partnership with the International Association of Emergency Managers, we are now offering 1 contact hour of emergency management training through the IAEM certification program. To receive the credit, you're required to attend for the entire session. Please visit the Making Mitigation Work website at hazards.colorado.edu and contact Katie Murphy for more information on receiving your certificate for attending this webinar today. Katie's email address is on the webinar website for Making Mitigation Work. If at any point during the presentation you have questions or comments, you can offer those either via the chat function or the Q&A box on Zoom. You can set the chat function so only the presenter and administrators see your comments or everyone on the webinar. Our speaker will respond to questions as time permits during the webinar. For all others, we will share written responses via the Making Mitigation Work webinar page on our hazards.colorado.edu website. Before I introduce today's speaker, we wanted to ask a poll question of all of you. Specifically, we would like to know a little bit more about your background and into which category your work falls. Please answer the poll that is showing on your screen right now if you have downloaded the Zoom application. The question should now display, and we can see that several of you are responding already. For those without the Zoom application or those who have called in to the webinar, we will announce the poll results shortly. So it looks like about 1/4 of you who are joining us today are from an academic institution, about 17% are with federal, national, tribal, or territorial government, 16% with state government, 18% with local government, 11% from the private sector, 10% from nonprofit or voluntary sector organizations, and 1% from a professional association, and 2% retired or not employed. Thank you, Katie. Okay. Now, and without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our speaker for today's webinar, Colin Ford. Colin is an associate manager with the Fiscal Federalism Initiative at the Pew Charitable Trusts. The initiative examines fiscal and policy relationships between the federal government and states. Colin manages the team's work on disaster spending through stakeholder outreach and research design and implementation. I wanted to share with all of you on the webinar today about one of the first times that I actually saw Colin and his team in action. It was during the 2017 Natural Hazards Workshop here in Colorado. Colin and his colleagues presented the early results of their ongoing work on disaster spending and budgeting across the US. When I walked into the session that day, the room was packed and the audience was listening in rapt attention. In the years since that presentation, Colin and the team at Pew have continued forward with this important work. And today, we are so fortunate to have the opportunity to learn about the most recent progress with this ongoing initiative that is of crucial importance to our nation. Colin, thank you for joining with us today. We are going to turn the slide presentation capabilities over to you now. As we do that, I hope our webinar participants will join in offering a warm virtual welcome. Over to you, Colin.
Great, thanks so much, Lori, for the kind introduction. As I pull up my slides, just a moment, please. All right, can folks see my slides? And hear me? Okay, great. All right, well, thanks so much, Lori, for those kind words, and to the Natural Hazards Center and FEMA for the invitation to speak with you all today. And also thanks for all of you tuning in, for taking the time. I really appreciate it. As Lori said, I'm Colin Ford with the Pew Charitable Trusts. And some of you may be aware of Pew and our work, but for those who aren't, we're a global, independent, nonprofit and nonpartisan research and public policy organization. And we have dozens of programs working on everything from ocean conservation to reforming state budget funds, or state pension funds, I should say. But really the uniting mission is to bring research to bear to inform the public and to help policymakers develop and implement evidence-based policies. As Lori said, my team at Pew, the Fiscal Federalism team, studies the complex federal-state fiscal relationship. And over the last several years, we've been bringing that lens to the topic of natural disasters. Specifically, in an era of rising disaster costs, how could a better understanding of how our government spends on disasters help policymakers make more forward-thinking and strategic decisions about how to allocate our resources, specifically towards cost-saving mitigation? So with the time I have today, I'm going to walk through an overview of our research by honing in on 4 key areas. First, what is the state of play in the federal-state funding relationship when it comes to paying for disasters, and why should we be paying attention to the role of states? Second, within that context, how do states budget for disasters? What tools do they have in place to make sure the money is there when it's needed? Third, what do we know about what states are spending on disasters? And here's a preview of that. We don't know enough. And finally, how does all this discussion tie in with the broader conversation about how we can invest better as a nation in mitigation? So I'll plan to talk about the research for, I'd say, 25 to 30 minutes, and then we'll turn it over for plenty of time for Q&A. And with that, I will jump right into it with the first item, which is the federal-state relationship. So I suspect most folks on the call know our disaster assistance system in the US has a strongly interconnected federal-state local structure, with each level of government playing a critical role as events increase in cost and complexity. In other words, the bigger the disaster, the more likely all levels are to be involved, and the more complex and interconnected the funding streams become. So this may be a little elementary for this audience, but to break that down in another way, when a disaster strikes, local governments are the first line of defense. But if their resources are overwhelmed, states can step in with financial assistance, personnel, or assets. And through the process outlined in the Stafford Act, a state that is facing disaster impacts beyond their capacity can request a federal major disaster declaration and all of the federal assistance that comes with it. So since today's topic is the state-by-state story in this system, the first thing I want to emphasize here is that intergovernmental issues in disaster spending aren't isolated to a few disaster-prone states. And in fact, since 2013, all 50 states in DC have had such a declaration. And of course, with each of these events come costs. And the real thing to emphasize here is that those costs are on the rise. And that rising price tag is drawing the attention of policymakers across levels of government, but particularly at the federal level. So let's put some numbers to that. FEMA FEMA's largest disaster assistance program is the Public Assistance Program, and it had 8 of its most expensive years on record in the decade ending in 2016. As we all know, 2017 and 2018 were major years for disasters, and GAO estimates that since 2005, the federal government has spent $450 billion on disasters. And those rising numbers are why we've seen a steady drumbeat coming from Congress and the current administration and the previous administration about how the federal government and the nation as a whole can manage those rising costs. And since the way we fund disaster assistance in this country is so intertwined, those efforts will inevitably have implications for state and local governments. So again, for the sake of illustration, I'm going to roughly separate the movement that's coming from the federal level into 2 buckets. So the first is part of a long-term conversation that's around raising the threshold at which states would become eligible to receive a federal declaration, which would, it follows, leave states and local governments paying for a larger portion of disaster costs. So some may recall that during debate over the Disaster Recovery and Reform Act, which passed last year, this was an element that was raised. It wasn't included in the final bill, but that does not mean that the idea that the federal government is involved in too many smaller, less costly disasters has gone away. The second bucket of proposals that I'd highlight are efforts to incentivize states either using carrots or sticks to invest their own money in mitigation. So this includes examples like the public assistance deductible concept, which came out of the last administration, a provision in the bipartisan budget agreement in 2018 that would provide additional federal funding for states that invested their own money in mitigation. You've heard in the first webinar in this series about FEMA's National Mitigation Investment Strategy, which emphasizes the need to increase and align mitigation efforts across all levels of government and sectors. And I'd also include in this category examples like recent individual assistance guidelines updates that would take into account states' fiscal capacity when considering eligibility for the program. And I would say this dynamic was boiled down pretty well when in the midst of Hurricane Harvey in 2017, then FEMA Administrator Brock Long, himself a former state emergency management director, called the event a wake-up call for local and state elected officials to have full budgets, full staffs, rainy day funds, and state-level programs for individual assistance in public infrastructure recovery. And just a few weeks ago, Acting Administrator Gaynor echoed the sentiment, saying that the current system was, quote, unsustainable, and, quote, the only way we can survive as a nation is to set aside pre-disaster money and build state and local capacity, end quote. So all of this talk and action at the federal level raises some really important questions for states. If the federal government is looking to adjust its policies, what does that mean for state budgets? And what are states currently doing in terms of spending that is aligned or misaligned with federal incentives around mitigation and fiscal preparedness? So as I mentioned at the outset, we'll start to answer some of those questions with a preview of our forthcoming research on state budgeting for natural disasters. Then I'll look at some of our work on state tracking of that money, specifically our research that shows that most states aren't comprehensively tracking the full range of disaster spending that they're undertaking. And finally, we'll turn the conversation explicitly to mitigation, specifically how can both looking at budgeting and tracking spending help illuminate the full cost of disasters and hopefully identify opportunities to reprioritize spending to invest more in mitigation to reduce future costs. So let's jump in with budgeting. So when disasters happen, state funds have to flow, and that happens in 2 major ways. So if this is a smaller disaster or state level disaster, states spend their own funds on assistance to local governments or direct response capabilities. But even if a state receives a federal disaster declaration, Much of that funding is provided on a reimbursement basis, which means that state funds still need to be available in the short term to cover costs before they're partially or fully reimbursed. So for our upcoming report, we looked at 5 common mechanisms that states use to meet these budgeting challenges. State agencies spending their own budgets, disaster accounts at the statewide level, supplemental appropriations, transfer authority, or the ability to move funds between or within the state budget, and state rainy day funds, often used for budget stabilization. I'd note here that these are preliminary findings, so the state counts and some of the details may change slightly before the report is published. But our key finding here is that while these methods are used by a majority of states, how that happens looks very different state by state. And I'll highlight just a few examples, and we can talk about them further if folks have questions during the Q&A. So while 46 states in DC have a disaster account, what they can be used for, how they're funded, and the amount states put in them each fiscal year, if anything, varies. So for example, Utah has a disaster recovery restricted account for state declared disasters, but it also has a wildlands fire suppression fund solely for fire costs. In contrast, Maryland has a generally defined catastrophic event account that may be used for natural disasters, but can also be used in catastrophic situations that aren't disasters as well. 41 states in DC have transfer authority, where a designated official can move funds around the state government to where they're needed with limited or no action by the state legislature. But who can do that depends. In 21 states, it's the governor. In 9, a standing emergency commission made up of executive and sometimes legislative officials can do so. And in 7, an agency director has that ability. And finally, looking at rainy day funds, Alaska and 12 other state statutes list disasters as a specific purpose for their rainy day fund, but Louisiana's fund is constitutionally prohibited from being spent on disasters. So the takeaway from all these details is that states do have tools to budget for disasters, but each is currently using them in different ways. And as states think about how they'll confront rising disaster costs and potential federal changes to policy, reviewing those mechanisms that are currently in place and learning from other states and how they work is going to be critically important. So having looked at how states make sure money is there when they need it, they also have another important role, which is understanding how it's spent. So in 2016 and 2017, as Lori mentioned, my team at Pew surveyed state emergency managers asking for state spending over a 5-year period across all of the agencies involved and for both federal and state level disasters. And our key finding from that was that most states don't comprehensively track their disaster spending. And by that, we mean across all of the many agencies involved and across all of the phases of disaster. So not just response and recovery, but also mitigation and preparedness spending. But from the information that we gathered from states, that spending varies widely in terms of the purpose and the dollars spent. And that in turn has implications for the federal proposals that I outlined up front. And based on that information, we recommended that state and federal policymakers prioritize more comprehensively tracking that information. So why don't states currently comprehensively track their disaster spending? Well, our research uncovered a number of obstacles. The first and foremost being that disaster spending is spread across many agencies. So at the federal level, the most immediate agency that comes to mind, and the co-host of today's webinar, is FEMA, who is in charge with coordinating and running some of the biggest disaster programs that our nation has. But the fact of the matter is that at least 17 major departments and agencies are involved in disasters. And what's more, our analysis has shown that majority of federal spending on disasters actually comes from outside FEMA, from agencies like the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Housing and Urban Development, Defense, and Transportation. Well, it's an equally complex story at the state level. So Florida, one of the states we worked with on our report, reported spending from as many as 11 different agencies. And so that creates a situation where it's not just the sheer number of agencies adding to complexity, but agencies may use different financial systems to track their spending. They may code disaster spending in different ways, all of which makes it a challenge to get an interagency picture of where spending is going out the door for disasters. The second challenge is that disasters are episodic in nature, which means that these expenses are not occurring in a predictable annual basis like other types of state spending. So governors and state legislators aren't necessarily paying state attention to disasters in the same way that they would for recurring issues like Medicaid or K-12 education. And third, there's simply the issue of capacity. So we were working with state emergency management agencies that may not have large staff. They may be dealing with ongoing disasters, all of which makes it a challenge for states to get a handle on this spending. The bottom line is really that there is no single source for comprehensive information about state spending on natural disasters. But what about the data we were able to collect? So we heard back from 23 states to our survey with varying levels of completeness, and we worked with 8 to nail down information that we could draw some conclusions about. And what we found is that state spending, as I've said, varies in both dollars and purpose. So states spend differently on their own public assistance programs, their own individual assistance programs, and mitigation efforts. And they also vary in how they share federally related costs with local governments. And I can talk in more detail about that during the Q&A if folks have questions. But what that means is that the federal policy changes that would use state-owned spending on the programs and the existence of mitigation spending as metrics would affect these states differently, which again is why we recommend collecting more comprehensive data. So what can be done about this? I'm going to highlight 2 states that have undertaken efforts or that align with the recommendations from the report before I move into the last section on mitigation. So the first instance is North Carolina, which last year established the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resilience. And that agency is tasked in part with tracking spending on the state's recent hurricanes. And that means creating quarterly reports about spending that's going out the door that the state has allocated towards recovery from those events. Second, Ohio, in the course of working with us on our research, established a policy through their state budget office and their state emergency management agency to start collecting information on state-level disasters when they begin to occur. The result in both of these situations is more complete information on the amount and purpose of money going out the door. I'd like to add here that a number of states, including Tennessee, Washington, and the Carolinas, are undergoing statewide resiliency planning efforts. And we think that thinking about fiscal resiliency is an important part of those efforts when you're looking across the state at activities that are dealing with resilience to natural disasters. And that brings me to my final point, which is on mitigation. So I would also say here that a lot of these points apply at the federal level as well. So knowing how we budget for disasters and tracking our spending isn't just good fiscal practice. Knowing the full costs of disasters will hopefully open up opportunities to invest more strategically in cost-saving mitigation measures. So this group will be well aware of this stat that every dollar spent in federal grants on mitigation, so that's activities that states can take to reduce the impact of future disasters like home buyouts, tornado safe rooms, earthquake retrofits, can save an average of $6 in post-disaster recovery costs. Well, earlier this summer, we released an analysis that used data from the study where that statistic comes from the National Institute of Building Sciences to take a look a level deeper. And what we found was that every state sees a positive return on investment from mitigation. And while it ranges from nearly $7 in Kansas to just over $3 in California, 35 states see a return of $6 or more in savings for every dollar invested. So just as the federal government has its eye on its rising price tag, they also have their eye, as you've heard from other presenters in this series, on the value of mitigation. So again, I would highlight some of the policies that folks who have tuned into previous presentations have heard, such as the new Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities program, which can provide a permanent source of funding for mitigation activities before the event occurs, or pre-disaster mitigation. The National Mitigation Investment Strategy, which highlights ways that we can align and build on our mitigation efforts as a nation. As I mentioned, in 2018 bipartisan budget agreement, which would tie investments in mitigation to additional federal funding. And this is something that's also being acted on at the state level. So the state of Texas, as it was dealing with providing state level funding for Hurricane Harvey recovery, put aside $800 million from its rainy day fund to go towards mitigation activities. So as these policies and commitments are gaining traction, both at the federal, state, and local level, better information about the totality of spending is really going to be a critical piece of that as we figure out how our resources can increasingly go towards that type of effort. With that, I will turn over to questions, but just reiterate that the federal-state funding relationship in natural disasters is under stress thanks to more frequent, severe, and expensive events, and having more comprehensive and fact-based information about how states are currently dealing with these expenses and improving how we track the money that's going out the door at all levels are going to be key steps to getting a handle on the costs and really realizing our shared goal of making mitigation work. And I look forward to sharing our upcoming research with folks and to answering any questions and really having a discussion about these topics moving forward.
Colin, thank you so much for that presentation. To start, we have a question about the slide that you had up with the state-by-state spending, showing that the different, that mitigation saves in all 50 states. So I don't know if you can reshare your those slides. Not only am I very proud that my home state of Kansas was #1 there, but we have a couple of questions from listeners about what methodology did Pew use to arrive at those aggregate numbers at the state level. So could you talk to us a little bit about that? And then we see that several questions are flowing in. So once you answer that one, then we'll move to the next ones in the box. Thank you, Colin.
Sure thing. So I'm just going to navigate to that slide. So this analysis was based on underlying data that was shared with us by the National Institute of Building Sciences. So we were able to take, sorry, I'm still navigating there and trying to talk at the same time. I probably shouldn't do that. We were able to take that information about the costs and the benefit and cost ratio for the multiple hazards that NIBS looked at for each state, and then aggregate that up to a state level return on investment. So the publication that this map comes from also includes an interactive map where folks can look at the benefit cost ratio for each of the hazards that go into the National Institute of Building Sciences calculation.
Nice. Thank you, Colin. So our next question up is April asked if you have specific data for South Carolina and North Carolina that can be shared, and sort of more generally, if there are listeners on the webinar who are interested in the underlying data sources, does Pew share?
So in terms of this mitigation saves analysis that we did, the state-by-state breakdown, there is data for download associated with that publication, and I'm happy to share that publication with folks. The Carolinas specifically, in terms of our disaster spending work, they weren't among the states that we worked closely with to collect more detailed information about their spending, but our forthcoming report on disaster budgeting is a 50-state assessment. So that will include data related to how all 50 states in the District of Columbia budget for disasters.
While we're on the state-by-state question, Tom wanted to know about Alaska and Hawaii, since they're not currently showing on the map. Do you have data for those states?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The National Institute of Building Sciences Mitigation SAVE study actually did not include Alaska and Hawaii due to data limitations. So as a result, we also weren't able to include them in this state-by-state breakdown. However, they will be included in our disaster budgeting work. And I believe Alaska was one of the states that provided us with some data for our disaster spending paper.
Could you share a little bit, Colin, about any research that you or your team have done into tribal efforts for mitigation, especially as related to disparities, and if there is anything that recognized tribes can do to be brought into the fold and into this conversation and encouraged to mitigate?
Right. I mean, I certainly think that both tribes and territories have similar lessons to be learned. I mean, I'm not entirely familiar with the way that emergency management is run, or if there's the same sort of fractured nature in terms of how spending occurs in those entities, but certainly the lessons of taking a more comprehensive look at where your spending is going and understanding that these pressures exist not only in terms of rising disaster costs, but also from the federal level are critical lessons, I think, that can be applied beyond state governments and frankly at the local level as well. We would have loved to include more about locals in this study, in the spending study, but of course, collecting 50 state data is one challenge. Collecting data from tens of thousands of municipalities is another.
Yes, thank you, Colin, and understood. But while we're on the data availability question, someone also did ask about territories and specifically about Puerto Rico. And so do you have any data or information or other additional projects focused specifically on Puerto Rico?
We don't specifically. We tend to, on our team, use states and the District of Columbia as a unit of analysis, but certainly if we're talking about where some of the pressures are coming from at the federal level, the federal spending that has gone towards recovery in Puerto Rico is a major aspect of that. And I think, again, I just reiterate that the lessons for states can be applied at the territory level. Sometimes it can be difficult. We often say, if you've seen one state, you've seen one state. And I think for territories, the challenge can even be more than that. But it's certainly an area that's ripe for additional research.
Nice, thank you. Grace wanted to know when the most recent results from the research that you presented to us today will be released and published.
So our aim for the budgeting research is spring of next year. We've wrapped up our research and are going through our internal publication and data checking process here at Pew, which is a process that we take seriously. So I'm hoping for spring of next year, but can't commit exactly.
Okay. And Colin, you did a really great job of describing for us the varied approaches that states take for budgeting for disasters. But Maria wanted to know if you could also elaborate a bit more on the types of mitigation that are used by the different states. So buyout, elevation, et cetera. And is there one type or a set of types that are more frequently used by many of the states?
So we didn't do any sort of assessment of the type of projects that states were doing. I will say when we asked states for their spending on mitigation, we did get some flavor of what they were spending on. So I'll give some examples of that. So during the time period we looked at, Arkansas had spent $10 million on a tornado safe room program and assistance to local governments for infrastructure improvements. Iowa had spent $49 million on municipal mitigation projects for flooding. North Dakota's State Water Commission had spent $226 million to support local flood control and property acquisitions. Ohio had spent $11 million on riverine flooding projects, and Oregon had spent $36 million on earthquake retrofits for public structures. And I would also add that we have another team at Pew called the Flood Prepared Communities team, and they are coming out with a study next week that highlights 13 examples of state and local governments who have undertaken implemented policies that have resulted in positive mitigation results, and I can be sure to share that with this group once that's published next week.
That would be great, Colin, and we will definitely post that on your Making Mitigation Work webinar page. So thank you for offering to share that. And related to that, Virginia asked a question about the report from NIBS with the Mitigation Saves and Mitigation Saves 2.0. And Virginia, actually, if you go to the Making Mitigation Work webinar series page for Keith Porter, who was our presenter 2 sessions ago in September. We actually have linked to those reports via our pages, or you can find those through the NIBS website. So thank you for asking about that. And again, Colin, thank you for being willing to share additional resources. We have a best practices question, Colin, that came in from Brian. He wanted to know, you mentioned during your presentation your partnerships with North Carolina, Ohio, Tennessee, and a couple of other states. And so Brian wanted to know if you have some recommendations or insights in terms of best practices for tracking disaster spending at the state level that's come out of this research.
That's a great question. And I think part of the challenge in creating systems to track is how differently states do this now. So I think a lot of it requires state partners and the key folks who can weigh in to get their heads together at the state level and figure out what works best for them. So in Ohio, what that translated into was a system wherein when the state Emergency Operations Center has a partial activation, a memo goes out to state agencies requesting that they start tracking their spending to be reported to the State Emergency Management Agency and the State Budget Office. And part of the reason they came up with that system was that their accounting system didn't allow them to add a new field that would have allowed them to pull the information more directly. And we do have a publication up on our website that's a question and answer with one of the staff people who helped establish that policy that can help sort of outline what that looks like. North Carolina's approach is somewhat different in that it originated from legislation. So as part of the supplemental recovery funding that the state provided following hurricanes, they created this North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resilience to help track both federal spending, and they outlined different types of tracking that the agency needed to do of the state-only spending. So in that instance, you see the creation of a centralized body that has the authority and really the direction from the legislature to collect that type of information and report it both to the legislature and to others. So you can imagine that down the road, that information can be fruitful not only to policymakers but to researchers as well, who can look at that and see, where the money has gone, and then think about how you can direct it differently. So those are sort of two contrasting ways that states have done it. We're very interested in hearing how other states are approaching it, and sharing those best practices with states so they can figure out what works best for them. One thing I will add that was part of our recommendation in the report is that ultimately to have comparable and standardized data across states, we would benefit from a national coordinated effort to look at how this spending is going out the door. Because one of the challenges in our study was being able to create apples to apples information across states, since states are structured so differently. So that's another consideration to think about in discussing how this could be improved moving forward.
Thank you, Colin. And we actually had a complimentary question from Sydney. So Brian was really looking for best practices on disaster spending, but then Sydney asked a question about disaster costs. So what are the costs on the back end of the disaster? And similarly, Grace asked a question related to how disasters were defined in the first place. And so we're looking at hurricanes, earthquakes, what about effects of climate change, rising sea levels, et cetera. So can you kind of take us a step back before there's even that response, recovery, or mitigation funding being applied, to talk to us about how you measured the disaster costs and how you thought about disaster type in this research?
Sure, I'll start with how we scoped disaster type. And part of that, as any researcher will understand, is out of necessity for scoping, right? And creating defined parameters. So since a lot of the federal discussion was around changes to the Stafford Act, we decided to look there for guidance about how to define disasters. So we really did focus on these natural catastrophes as opposed to explicitly man-made events. Part of the challenge is that that's not always clearly defined, either in reality or in statute, but we provided guidance to states when collecting information to help guide what we were looking for, and then work with them to ensure that that was aligned. And remind me what the second half of the question was.
Yeah, thank you, Colin. It was about how disasters were defined. So were they seen as discrete events, hurricanes, earthquakes, tornadoes, et cetera? Or were you thinking about sea level rise and climate change related disasters, cascading disasters, et cetera?
Right. I think a lot of it was about, so we did initially ask states to tag the spending related to the type of hazard, though anybody who's worked in this will recognize the challenge there, that things often slip between which disaster is related. There are cascading disasters. So that was a challenge, but we did our best to provide definitions that states could respond to, and then be clear about those definitions in the report. But I think one of the things to tease out of that question is also that what counts as a mitigation project is often complicated. And so that's where I think a lot of this sort of invisible spending related to mitigation is already occurring across agencies in your state, like the Department of Environmental Quality or the Department of Transportation. And I think that's where some of these statewide resiliency planning efforts really come in, to sort of take stock of what these efforts are going on across the state and figure out, the best way to coordinate them and to move them forward. And again, I'd reiterate that we think that, including looking at spending is an important part of that.
Colin, I think a clear message of your presentation has been exactly how complicated this is to operationalize and then to ultimately track. But we have another tracking question. So this one
Sure.
is from Ed. He wanted to know if there's any consideration of tracking how much private individuals, companies, businesses are spending due to the enforcement of higher standards of construction that's designed to reduce the disaster costs. Similarly, if there's any effort to track preparedness efforts related to evacuation planning, drills, and other actions that are also designed to save life and property.
Sure. So in terms of let me actually answer part of the previous question quickly, which was around cost versus spending. So I want to be clear that what we look at is expenditures on disasters. So that's money going out the door from governments, as opposed to more broadly talking about costs, which I think is something that can be more broadly defined as sort of the economic impacts, losses of life, those types of efforts. So I think that's an important distinction to draw. And I think it's related to my response to this question, which is, if you're talking about the costs or spending of, changes to the built environment, that can be very difficult to track. But I would point to the efforts of the Center for Disaster Philanthropy and their State of Disaster Philanthropy report for an example of how to quantify spending that's going out the door from different sectors that are dealing with disasters. And their findings have shown that, the bulk of giving, either from philanthropy or some private sector folks, is going towards response, immediate response, and is missing in areas like mitigation and that long-term recovery spending. In terms of the spending that goes towards preparedness, like exercises and those activities, that is something that we ask states to provide us in their in their spending numbers. So certainly there are costs that go towards those types of efforts, and that's something that should be captured as well, because you can imagine that that's also contributing to being more resilient to these events before they happen.
Nice. So Kathleen asked the question, what can city and county leaders do to encourage their states to follow your advice and set aside more funds for both disaster mitigation and response? Also, how can city and county leaders be encouraged to have this sort of greater flexibility in terms of accessing the funds? So can you talk to some of the things you've learned about disaster budgeting, city and county, and even state level leadership, et cetera? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of encouraging states, I think, and this is just off the top of my head, honestly, is thinking about who the state partners are that you work with and figuring out if they're talking to one another. And if they're not, raising this idea that, as a local, I'm dealing with these programs that are being administered across state government. And as somebody who's maybe the recipient of that assistance, it's in our best interest that we're looking at it holistically and figuring out, where there are inefficiencies, where there's duplication of effort, or where there's opportunities to apply those resources more strategically. So that would be my main thought there, and hopefully you could bring our report too.
So thank you, Colin. Sean had a question that's really about kind of the appetite of states for engaging in these different approaches or using the different tools that you described to us. So Sean really wanted to know, are states receptive to moving forward with these different approaches, or is there kind of a waiting for the federal government, assuming that the federal government's going to come in with these post-disaster dollars? So will you kind of talk to us about the mood on the ground, so to speak?
You know, I can't speak too specifically to that. I will say that the group that we worked with most closely to collect information about disaster spending was the National Emergency Management Association, which is the state association of state emergency management directors. And that's a group that's been very receptive to participating in that and seeing the value of it, and seeing the value of being able to articulate what your efforts are as a state in the face of both, you know, generally rising disaster costs, but also these moves at the federal level. I would say the other group that, so the folks we're working with on the disaster budgeting report are the National Association of State Budget Officers and the state budget officers, which are located often in the governor's office. And I think there's also receptivity there, that these are costs that are going to put stress on state budgets, and it's better to move ahead of time and start thinking about assessing how you do things than to wait till after the fact.
So, Colin, you mentioned during the presentation really the movement toward, in several of the states, toward the resiliency planning in addition to the other recovery, response, and mitigation efforts that you were tracking. So Summer wanted to know if there's a list somewhere of the states that have already engaged in the statewide resiliency planning efforts that you mentioned briefly.
You know, I believe there is. However, I do not have it handy, and I don't want to speak off the cuff and get something wrong. So let's look at that one for the written response afterwards, so I can make sure I don't say the wrong thing.
Wise words. Thank you. And I wanted to say, we actually see that there are several call-in listeners, call-in that we can see on the webinar, but I'm so sorry to the call-in listeners who have raised their virtual hands. This webinar is set up so only the panelist has speaking privileges. And so I apologize that we can't turn that on, but so if you're able to please type your questions and if into the chat or Q&A box, and if you can't type your questions in, you can email them directly to Katie or Colin, and we can definitely include those in the written responses. And so Colin, you're like a teacher with a classroom with 9 hands up in the air that unfortunately we cannot answer. I'm sorry about that, Colin. But another question that was written in the chat or the Q&A box is from April. So she wanted to know if you recommend asking the development industry to have bonds to guarantee that what they're constructing now will not flood in a 500 or 1,000-year flood event, for example, and so really sort of emphasizing the long-term cost to the taxpayers that are getting passed forward by developers and communities, and how overwhelming this is. And so essentially, Colin, can you speak to sort of the relationship to the development industry in terms of this work you're doing? And thanks, April, for the question.
You know, I can't speak directly to that question, but I think it does raise an important point, which is that some of the funding for these efforts does come from mechanisms that aren't necessarily budgeting or direct government spending. One that we've been looking at for our disaster budgeting report is states' use of insurance. So whether that's states holding a self-insurance fund or purchasing commercial insurance to protect their property and assets from disaster damages. That's one item, and there are these other innovative financing measures that are out there that we haven't specifically looked into, but again, I think are an important piece of this puzzle if you're talking about not only spending from the government, but also from the private sector, and using these financial instruments.
Okay, Colin, thank you so much for the presentation. I think that you really emphasize for us how important it is to know the full cost of disaster spending so we can actually spark this sort of evidence-informed action that you have been so clearly articulating the need for. I think you've also given us a sense of just how complex this challenge really is, but you've also helped to begin to illuminate a path forward. And so we really want to thank you for this presentation. For we got through the questions we were able to see on the screen, but if others had questions that you weren't able to articulate in the written form, again, if you could please send those to Colin or to Katie, and we will make sure and post any remaining written responses on our website or any follow-up responses that Colin wants to share. We also, in addition to really thanking Colin for this presentation, we wanted to thank all of you for your excellent questions and for joining with us today, and to thank FEMA and the National Science Foundation for making this webinar series possible. Before we close, we do have a few brief announcements that we wanted to share with all of you. First, a reminder that if you have attended for the duration of this webinar and you would like to receive credit for attending, please contact Katie Murphy to receive your certificate of attendance. Additional information about how to apply this webinar towards your AEM or CEM are available on the Making Mitigation Work webinar page at hazards.colorado.edu. Second, we are also really thrilled to announce to our participants on the webinar today that our first 9 grant proposals have been funded through the newly established Mitigation Matters Small Grant Program that was made possible with the support of FEMA and NSF. So please do visit the grants program page on the Natural Hazard Center website to learn more about these 9 really exciting mitigation focused projects that are going to be carried out over these next several months. And while you are up there on the grants program tab, we hope that you will click over to the quick response grant program page. The center this last week issued a special call for QR proposals in response to the most recent round of devastating California wildfires. So we hope that you'll visit the quick response program page to learn more, and note that the application window for this special call is November 11th through the 25th. And please know that our hearts and minds are with the people of California and those who are responding to the fires and beginning the long road to recovery. Finally, we did want to note that we will not hold a webinar in December, and we are wishing you all a warm and safe holiday season. We will definitely look forward to welcoming you back to the webinar series, and ask that you please save January 14th, 2020 from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern on your calendars. Our first webinar of the new year and new decade promises to be an interesting one. Please plan to join us so you can learn more about the new No Code, No Confidence campaign from Leslie Chapman Henderson of Flash and John Ingargiola and Edward Latch from FEMA. You can find more information on our website at hazards.colorado.edu. This is where we will post the webinar recording, slides, and additional resources from Colin's webinar today, as well as where you can find more information on past and future webinars in the series. Again, thank you so much to Colin for joining with us today and sharing your research and wisdom. And on behalf of the entire team here at the Natural Hazard Center, we hope to see you all again soon. Please take care of yourself and others.